is a small, neglected room inside every life where conversation has been left on mute and the furniture of habit gathers dust. Step into that room, and you do not first notice absence. You notice a depth, a quality of air, as if the world had drawn in a collective breath and paused. The modern mind imagines silence as a blank to be filled, a pause to be interrupted. But the ancient way of listening teaches that silence is not a gap between sounds, but a field in which sound itself takes shape. To enter it is to change the scale of what listening can be. Begin by noticing how noise arranges itself like a crowd around a single word. The city, the calendar, the ceaseless stream of opinions, each demands a patch of attention and stitches our hours into distraction. Yet when the noise recedes, something uncrowded appears. A gauze between events, a sliver of stillness that keeps time differently. This sliver is the faculty of attention without agenda. It is an organ of perception not trained to collect facts, but to hold what happens in undivided presence. In that holding, the world seems less eager to prove itself and more willing to reveal its contours. Listening, in this sense, is an art of being curved, not pointed. We learn to soften the edges of expectation so that experiences may pass through us without collision. The teacher Ram Dass, in urging quietness, is not asking for speechlessness as punishment, but for a reorientation of the senses so they may attune to subtler textures. The cadence of a thought before it names itself, the aftertaste of a memory, the hush that precedes a decision. These are not merely mental phenomena. They are invitations to taste existence at a different temperature. Silence composes its own grammar. It knows the pauses that make a sentence wise, and the intervals that allow a melody to complete itself. When you practice lowering the volume of internal commentary, you create a space where perceptions can align with truth instead of being filtered through urgency. This alignment is not an event you manufacture. It is a letting be, a consent to not immediately translate every sensation into a narrative. In this consent, curiosity wakes. Curiosity is the humble sibling of silence. It asks without forcing and receives without grabbing. There is an economy to quiet listening. Words are expensive. They require movement, identity, a stake in outcome. Silence, by contrast, is cheap but rich. It yields depth without claiming authorship. In the silence that is practiced, one discovers that the self is less a fortress and more an aperture. The aperture admits sensations that do not belong to its construction. The ache of another, the small joy of light on water, the unannounced presence of awe. These intrusions do not diminish the self, they enlarge the horizon in which the self is seen. Do not mistake silence for retreat. It is a courageous posture, because to persist in silence is to resist the easy comfort of explanation. The mind wants to resolve, to tidy experience into cause and effect. Silence asks instead for patience, a willingness to allow answers to form in their own time, often arriving as insight rather than logic. This patience becomes a discipline, a daily practice of unhooking from the immediate imperative to comment and replacing it with the steadiness of attention. Over time, the interior climate changes. Thoughts no longer dominate like storm fronts. They appear as weather, transient, intelligible, and ultimately passing. Listen now to the small difference between hearing and being heard. To hear is to receive sound. To be heard is to offer sound the place to rest. Silence is both receiver and resting place. It is the field in which the voice loses its tyranny and regains its clarity. When the mind allows this inversion, when it becomes abode rather than announcer, what was once noise may begin to disclose meaning. A subtle question hangs in that disclosure, asking whether the silence we avoid is in fact the source we have been listening for all along. What if the source we have been avoiding is not elsewhere but under our feet, a steady listening that has taken the shape of the world itself? Where the last part paused with a question about whether silence is the origin we were seeking, this next step traces the contours of that origin and listens how it answers without words. Silence, when tended, reveals layers, not a single void, but a stratified field where sensitivity is refined like ore hammered into a blade. Each layer has its own timbre and its own invitation, and passing through them changes the way we measure time, value, and presence. Imagine a shoreline at twilight. Daylight is still deciding to leave, and the sea keeps repeating its movements with a patience that has no deadline. The shore, our ordinary awareness, collects the spent phrases of the day, the rehearsed opinions, the small resentments, the grocery list of desire. If one stands very still, a smaller meter begins to register beneath the roar, the tiny, almost inaudible hiss between the waves, the sediment of silence that was always present, yet unnoticed. That hiss is not nothing. It is a secret rhythm, an undercurrent that shapes the larger motion of the ocean. To discover it is to realize that the observable surface was never the totality. There is a transformation in attentional posture when attention shifts from consuming narrative to attending to nuance. The mind moves from being a commentator to becoming a custodian. In that custodial role, attention shelters what passes, a sigh of relief, a spontaneous smile, the arrival of grief, the hum of authentic curiosity. These occurrences often dissolve quickly because the culture around this insists on quick appraisal and categorization. Silence, however, gives these small phenomena the room to consolidate into insight. Think of insight not as a sudden illumination, but as a slow crystallization where disparate experiences lock into a pattern that makes a different kind of sense. When silence deepens, the borders between inner and outer soften. Sensations that were formerly privatized, shame, longing, the faint echo of childhood, begin to reveal their kinship with the world's textures. Loneliness might be understood as a valley shaped by a lack of connected listening. Tenderness might be recognized as the residue of someone else's soft attention lingering in the body. In silence, these recognitions are less likely to be judged and more likely to be seen. In being seen, they lose their isolation and become part of a larger choreography of life that does not require us to perform in order to belong. This softening of borders carries a paradox. The quieter the mind, the more it discovers not less self, but a truer sense of self. Not a fixed identity, but a relational presence that arises in contact. The self becomes less a proprietor and more an instrument tuned by circumstance. Instruments do not resist the music that plays through them. They are shaped by it. And in their responsiveness, they reveal qualities of the music otherwise hidden. Likewise, when the mind listens from the quieter place, experiences play through it and disclose harmonies that were invisible in the clamor. There is also an ethical turn in this quietness. Listening without the reflex to judge alters how one meets others. The quick verdicts that distance and diminish begin to soften. A different economy of interaction emerges, one that values receptivity over persuasion, understanding over correction. This does not mean passivity. It means allowing the world to be a teacher rather than a target. It means learning that influence can come through resonance and presence more than through argument or force. Yet silence is not an escape into a private sanctum. It is a passageway into responsibility, a responsibility to hear what the silence has to say about the self and the community it inhabits. In that responsibility, small acts of awareness ripple outward. The interior quiet that recognizes a neighbor's pain may shift a gesture, a tone, a choice toward tenderness. The sanctuary of attention becomes a site from which life is attended, not avoided. Listen now to the image of a bell made of water. Its rim, the surface of ordinary thought, its core, the deep reservoir of listening. Strike it gently with the mallet of attention, and the whole bell trembles, but not in noise, in tone. The tone that emerges carries a resonance that reaches into the world and back again, suggesting that listening is never solitary. What would happen if the quiet inside us multiplied into a community of quiet? What would be heard then that now is only hinted at? The bell made of water trembled at the edge of the last image, its tone suggesting a conversation between inner pool and outer shore. Follow that tone now into a narrowing corridor where sound becomes less about information and more about revelation. The bell does not demand a response. It simply allows a vibration to complete itself, and by doing so, opens a space that was previously occupied by doing. In that space, something listens that has no agenda, a presence that receives like a lake receives rain, without calculation, without the need to claim the drops as meaning anything specific. To rest in such listening is to discover that silence is not absence, but a kind of fullness that refracts experience into clarity. Consider the way a lens clarifies only when dust is removed. Our habitual chatter is the dust. Silence is the slow cleaning. As layers fall away, images regain their proportions. A memory returns, not as a replay, but as a lighted object with edges and depth. An emotion arrives not as a storm, but as a shape that invites patience. This is not a technique for escaping life, but an invitation to encounter life more honestly. When the mind consistently lowers its volume, the noise that once claimed priority diminishes, and what was peripheral can take its place in the center. In that reordering, meaning is not manufactured, it is discovered. There is a humility in this discovery. Wisdom here is not a trophy to be earned, but a weather pattern to be noticed. The quiet does not grant superiority. It returns us to proportionality. We begin to see how small our certainties are, how large the unknown that hosts them. The paradox of silence is that in losing the arrogance of always saying we know, we gain an ability to hear the subtle ways the world invites us. An unanswered question held in the quiet often changes its shape and becomes a lamp rather than a demand. As attention becomes a receptive instrument, time itself alters. Moments expand into corridors where perception can walk and examine. The hurried ticks of obligation unclench, and depth arrives not by adding more, but by allowing more to be present. In this spaciousness, compassion arises naturally, not as moral labor, but as the simple consequence of contact. When we hear without immediately explaining, the other is less a problem and more a presence. We begin to respond from resonance rather than from reflex. Small mercies emerge, an ear that receives without fixing, a silence that witnesses rather than prescribes. Imagine now a house of glass set in a silent forest. Inside the house, a single candle burns. The flame does not do anything to command the forest. It only shows how darkness is not a void, but a carrier of forms. The candle's light reveals dust motes that in daylight were themselves unnoticed. In an analogous manner, cultivated silence unfolds inner details that daylight thinking had either flattened or overlooked. These details are not trivia, they are the seams through which the sacred enters the ordinary. The hidden becomes visible by virtue of attention that has relinquished crisis mode and learned to be steady. The culmination of this movement is not an exaltation, but a return to the immediacy of being where hearing and being heard coalesce. The final quiet is not a passive blankness, it is a rich silence that holds a paradox. In stillness, we are more alive. In non-acting, we act more truly. In less speaking, we say more. The world, when met with this kind of listening, answers with a clarity that is not didactic, but intimate. Truth in the quiet presents itself like a face emerging from fog, recognizable yet newly intimate. Let the bell of water fade into the lake it was made from. In that fading, notice the trace left behind, a subtle rearrangement of how you measure inner distance, an unspoken covenant with attention. The quieter you become, the more you are able to hear not merely sounds, but the architecture of presence itself. In that hearing, the forgotten truths about self, about other, and the weave that binds them begin to whisper with the authority of what has always been there. Sit with that whisper until it is no longer a concept, but an inhabited fact. Let the silence be your companion, not your retreat. In the shelter of that companion, the final word is not a sentence, but a stillness that opens the world wider than thought ever could.